Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. And today we're going to get into those common sayings that don't actually make sense. You know, like the ones you use all the time without even thinking about it, even though they sound a little ridiculous when you really think about what you're actually saying.
Right.
We've got a ton of your sources here on idioms, where they came from, how they're used now, and even some alternatives we can use. This is going to be fun.
It's amazing, how language can preserve these little pieces of the past. Idioms are almost like these little linguistic time capsules, even when we've totally forgotten why we even say them in the first place.
Okay, so can you give us some background before we get to the examples? What exactly makes an idiom nonsensical?
Well, sometimes like the original meaning of the saying has just been lost. Like over time, people forget. Other times the imagery of the saying just doesn't really fit how we use it today.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's like, using a rotary phone to try and describe a smartphone. I mean, the technology has obviously moved on, but we still use the old word.
That makes sense. So let's dive into some examples. I'm really curious about the origins of some of these phrases. Like, where do we even begin?
Well, let's start with a classic.
Yeah.
A bad apple spoils the bunch.
Hmm.
I mean, it sounds simple enough, right? But did you know that this idiom actually came from a very practical observation about storing fruit?
Storing fruit. I never would have thought of that. Tell me more.
So back in the day, people noticed that if you had a rotten apple, it could actually cause all the other apples around it to rot even faster.
Okay.
Turns out it's because of a gas called ethylene, which speeds up the ripening process and, well, in this case, the rotting process.
So the saying was initially about literal rotting apples and not about people.
Exactly. But over time, the meaning kind of evolved.
Mm.
Now we use it metaphorically to talk about how one negative person can affect an entire group, like
Right.
whether it's a team at work or even just a group of friends.
Eh.
That one bad apple can really bring the whole bunch down.
That's so interesting. It went from a practical tip about storing fruit to like a statement about social dynamics. Okay, what's another idiom with a surprising origin story?
How about bite the bullet? No, it means like bracing yourself for something unpleasant. But just imagine like a battlefield in the 1800s, no painkillers, and a surgeon's about to perform surgery.
Oof, I'm cringing just thinking about that.
Right.
Yeah.
So soldiers were actually given bullets to bite down on while they were having surgery.
Wow. Really?
Hmm.
Wow, that puts things in perspective. Dealing with a difficult client doesn't seem so bad now.
Right. It's a good reminder of how much language changes.
Yeah.
We might not be biting on real bullets anymore,
Yeah.
but the phrase still means, having that grit and determination when you have to face something unpleasant.
Okay, one more before we move on. How about let the cat out of the bag? What's that all about?
Well, this idiom is all about revealing secrets, often by accident. But the origins are a bit mischievous. Imagine a marketplace. Hundreds of years ago, someone selling what they say are these really cute and valuable piglets. But these piglets are hidden in bags.
I feel like there's a scam coming.
Exactly. So some shady vendors would actually swap out the piglet for a much cheaper cat right before they handed the bag over to the buyer.
Haha. So when the buyer got home and opened the bag, surprise, cat, not piglet.
Precisely. The trick was revealed, the cat was let out of the bag. And over time, this literal act of, revealing a scam turned into this broader metaphor for revealing any kind of secret.
It's really cool how idioms can preserve these little stories of everyday life from so long ago. Makes you wonder how many other sayings we use every day have these hidden stories behind them.
Absolutely. And that's what's so fun about doing these deep dives. We're not just, learning about language. We're getting these little peeks into history and culture.
Okay, so we've tackled a few idioms with surprising origins. Now, I'm curious about the ones that use animals. They just feel a bit nonsensical in today's world.
You're right, they often do. It's like they're these little leftovers from a time when we were interacting with animals on a much more regular basis.
What are some examples that come to mind for you? How about killing two birds with one stone?
Oh, that's a classic. We use it to talk about efficiency, like getting two things done with one action. But it's 2024, and all this bird stoning imagery is just kind of out of place.
Yeah, it is kind of jarring, right?
Yeah.
I mean, couldn't we just say something like solving two problems at once and get the same point across without the violence?
Exactly. It really makes you wonder, why even bring birds into it at all?
And it's not just birds. What about the elephant in the room? We're not really talking about elephants, are we?
Of course not. It's about that obvious problem that everyone knows about, but no one actually wants to talk about. The imagery is, vivid and all. But It's a pretty roundabout way to describe something pretty simple.
Maybe we could just say, let's address the obvious issue and leave the elephants out of it completely.
I'm all for being clear and direct. Sometimes that's all you need.
Okay, so animal imagery often leads to these idioms that don't really make sense, but there are also a lot that use violent imagery, and that can be kind of weird in everyday conversation.
Yeah, you're right. A lot of these phrases come from warfare or other, aggressive situations, but their meanings have definitely broadened since then.
What's a good example? How about jumping the gun?
Okay, think back to the old races where they use a starting pistol. Jumping the gun literally meant starting to run before the gun even went off.
So it was about a specific literal action.
Right. But now it means acting too soon or being impatient, like starting a project before you're ready or interrupting someone before they're done talking.
It's interesting how that idea of being impatient is still there, even though we're not talking about races anymore.
Absolutely. It's like the core meaning stays the same even as the situation changes. How about pull the trigger? I mean, making a decision rarely actually involves guns these days, right?
Unless it's a seriously intense board meeting, right? I'm kidding. But you're right, it's pretty dramatic for just making a choice. What's another one like that?
Shoot yourself in the foot is a good one for describing a mistake that you make that hurts yourself.
Ouch. Where does that one even come from?
Believe it or not, it goes all the way back to World War I.
Really?
Yeah, some soldiers would actually shoot themselves in the foot on purpose just so they wouldn't have to fight.
Wow. That's a pretty extreme way to get out of something.
It is. But the phrase stuck around, and now it means any kind of major mistake you make that makes things worse.
So we went from literal self-harm to this broader way of talking about messing things up. Language is so adaptable.
Yeah, it is. And sometimes that leads to these kind of strange, illogical sayings that we still use, even though they don't really make perfect sense.
Okay, speaking of expressions that don't make sense, can we talk about business jargon for a minute? It's like its own language, and it's full of these ridiculous phrases.
Oh, the buzzwords. They really are a gold mine of nonsense.
What are some of your favorite, or I guess least favorite ones? What about low-hanging fruit?
Oh, yeah, that's a classic.
Yeah.
It's supposed to mean easy tasks or quick wins. But unless you're literally working in an orchard, the metaphor just doesn't make sense.
Right. It's just trying too hard to be clever. Let's circle back is another one that makes me crazy. Are we talking about an agenda or are we planning a flight path?
It's like they're making simple things sound way more complicated than they need to be.
Maybe that's the whole point of corporate jargon, though, right? It's all about creating this sense of exclusivity, even if the ideas themselves are pretty basic.
That's an interesting point. Like they're trying to use language to create this sense of belonging to a special group or something.
Yeah, like a secret code.
Exactly. And speaking of secret codes, how about all those foreign expressions that get misinterpreted in translation?
Oh, those are good ones. Like, it's all Greek to me. I'm pretty sure that phrase didn't come from Greece.
You're right, it actually came from Latin. The phrase Grecum est, non legitur, which means it is Greek, it cannot be read. So even back then, people were already using Greek to mean something they didn't understand.
It's pretty cool how some phrases can move between languages and cultures, even if they get a little jumbled along the way.
It is. It shows how interconnected languages are, even across, huge amounts of time and distance.
What's another foreign expression that's kind of strange? What about throw someone under the bus? It's such a strong image, but where did that come from?
That one is a bit of a mystery, actually. No one knows for sure. But it became popular in the 1980s, and a lot of people think it's connected to politics.
That makes sense. Politics and metaphorical bus throwing.
Right.
It's like a classic combo. It's all about, sacrificing someone else to protect yourself, whether it's in politics or just, regular office drama. Okay, one last one. What about pulling out all the stops? Sounds like something you'd hear in an action movie.
This one comes from music,
Huh, really?
specifically pipe organs.
Wow, I did not expect that. Tell me more.
So pulling out the stops on a pipe organ let more air flow through, which made the music much louder.
Ah, okay. So pulling out all the stops evolved from a musical thing to a more general way of saying you're giving something your all.
Exactly.
Wow. It's amazing how these phrases can take on a life of their own, and their meanings just expand so much from where they first came from.
It's true. It shows how dynamic language really is and how it's always being shaped and reshaped by how people use it.
So we've covered a lot in this first part of our deep dive. We've explored idioms with these crazy origins. We uncovered the stories behind animal imagery and even dove into those violent phrases and confusing foreign expressions. It's really surprising how much history and culture is packed into these seemingly simple sayings.
It really is.
Yes.
It shows how language can both preserve the past and change with the times, even if the results can be, a little nonsensical and funny sometimes.
But before we move on and look at more of these illogical sayings and talk about some modern alternatives, I think it's good to take a minute to think about what we've learned.
I agree. I mean, recognizing these quirks of language is the first step to really understanding how they shape how we think and communicate.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah, for sure.
we've been talking about these idioms that don't quite make sense, the ones we use without realizing how silly they would sound if we really stopped to think about them.
It's like finding those linguistic fossils hiding in plain sight. Makes you wonder what people will think about how we talk, hundreds of years from now.
Now, that's a really interesting thought. I mean, language is always changing, right?
Yeah.
But speaking of change, what about the phrases that just completely contradict themselves?
You mean the ones that leave you going, wait, what? Like, how did that even become a saying?
Exactly. Like less is more. Logically, less is, well, less. It can't also be more, can it?
Exactly. How can something be less and more at the same time? It's like a paradox.
It is. But there's this deeper principle that it points to, one that applies to design, to art, even to how we live our lives.
Okay, now I'm really intrigued. Explain it to me.
Think about minimalist design. When you use fewer elements, you actually create a stronger sense of elegance and clarity. Like, a simple message is often much more powerful than a long, rambling one.
So less is more isn't about literal amounts then. It's more about the idea that simplicity and focus can lead to a better result.
Exactly. And it's not limited to design either. Think about your own life. Like, have you ever noticed that decluttering your home or getting rid of things on your schedule actually makes you feel more focused and productive?
I have. When my desk is a mess, I can't get anything done.
Mhm.
But when I clean it up and keep things simple, I'm way more efficient.
Exactly. Less is more reminds us that sometimes taking away the excess actually makes things clear. It helps us focus on what really matters. Quality over quantity.
That's a really good point. This saying that doesn't really make sense actually has some pretty good life advice hidden in it. What's another one of those head scratchers?
The exception that proves the rule is a good one. This one gets misinterpreted all the time.
Yeah, I can see why. It sounds like it's saying that breaking a rule somehow makes it stronger, but that doesn't make sense.
It doesn't. An exception, by definition, means going against the rule, right?
Hmm.
It doesn't prove it, it challenges it.
So how did this phrase get so popular if it's so illogical?
It probably comes from misunderstanding the original meaning, which, actually came from legal stuff. The idea is that having an exception can highlight a rule by showing when it doesn't apply. So like a sign that says, no parking except on Sundays is telling you that there's a rule against parking except for Sunday.
So it's not about the exception proving the rule, it's about the exception showing us the boundaries of the rule.
Right. It's subtle, but it gets lost in translation.
I think that's a big takeaway here. A lot of times these nonsensical sayings actually point to these bigger ideas or show us how tricky language can be. They make us think critically about the words we use.
I totally agree. That's what makes exploring them so interesting. We're not just learning some random trivia. We're actually understanding how language works.
Okay, so we've talked about finding clearer ways to say some of these things. What are some other phrases we can update?
Let the cat out of the bag is a
Okay.
good one to start with. Instead of that whole cat and bag image, we could just say, spill the secret, right? It's clear and gets the point across.
I like it. It's way more straightforward. And while we're at it, let's swap killing two birds with one stone for something like solving two problems at once.
Let's get rid of that bird violence. And instead of the elephant in the room, how about we just say, let's talk about the obvious issue?
Much better. What about some of the violent phrases? Like instead of jumping the gun, how about acting too quickly?
I like that. It gets the idea across without needing to talk about guns. And instead of pulling the trigger, we could just make the decision.
Simple. And to keep going with getting rid of the violent imagery instead of shoot yourself in the foot, we can just say, make a big mistake.
Exactly. We're on a roll here, a more peaceful vocabulary.
But before we get too excited about our new language, we can't forget about the never-ending world of business buzzwords. We touched on a few, but there are just so many that need to go.
Oh, I know. It's like a constant source of linguistic amusement. Or maybe frustration.
Probably both. Okay, Give me your top picks for the most ridiculous business buzzwords, the ones that absolutely have to go.
Synergy is a good place to start. Like it's supposed to be this magical force that makes things better when we all work together, but no one actually knows what it means.
It's like trying to make teamwork sound like some kind of mysterious power.
Exactly. It's just a fancy way of saying collaboration or teamwork, but without saying how it actually works.
And it's always followed by stuff like leveraging core competencies and driving impactful results.
It's like a whole language designed to sound impressive without actually saying anything.
What about think outside the box? Like it's supposed to be about creativity, but it's just so overused now.
It has, right. And what box are we even talking about? It's so vague, it doesn't actually help anyone be more creative.
It's like telling someone be more creative, but not actually giving them any tools to do it. What's another buzzword that makes you cringe?
Drill down is a good one. Like, it means to look at something in more detail, but I always imagine someone with a giant drill trying to get information from a rock.
It is a weird image, huh? Like, let's drill down into these sales numbers and see what we can find.
Right, just so unnecessarily complicated. Why not just say, let's analyze the sales data?
Keep it simple.
Hmm.
Okay, what about move the needle?
Another classic. It means to make a real difference or get some measurable result. But it makes me think about trying to thread a really tiny needle.
Yeah, it doesn't really sound like a big accomplishment, does it?
Not really. And bandwidth is another one that gets overused. Like it's an excuse for being too busy.
I don't have the bandwidth for that project right now. Like, our brains are all running on limited data plans.
Right. It's such a weak way to talk about mental capacity. Maybe we should just say, I'm too busy, or I need to focus on other things, and be honest about it.
Agreed. Honesty is always best. Okay, so it sounds like business jargon needs a serious makeover. Maybe it's time for a buzzword-free communication movement.
I'm in. Count me in.
We could even make a whole dictionary of replacements for these overused phrases. What do you think?
I love that. We could get suggestions from everyone listening and create something that helps everyone communicate more clearly, no matter what industry they work in.
We've covered so much in this second part of our deep dive. We've looked at those self-contradictory phrases, debunked some business buzzwords, and kept looking for more direct ways to express ourselves.
It really has been a cool journey through all the quirks of language, and there's still more to discover.
You're right. In the last part of our deep dive, we're going to look at even more of these crazy expressions and talk about what all this linguistic nonsense means for how we communicate in the future. Welcome back to the deep dive. We've been talking about those phrases we use without even thinking, even though they don't really make sense.
Right, from those old idioms to those violent expressions and all those business buzzwords we use, it's been pretty interesting.
It's like we're peeling back the layers of language and finding these little bits of history and cultural assumptions buried in the words we use every day.
And it makes you realize that language is more than just passing along information, right? It's about connecting with other people, expressing ourselves, even showing that we belong to a certain group or community.
It's been striking me that so many of these phrases we've talked about are just things we've heard so many times that we never even stopped to question them.
Yeah, that's the power of tradition, right?
Yeah.
Language can become so ingrained in our culture that it doesn't matter if it makes sense or not.
But now that we've kind of exposed the absurdity of some of these sayings, it's hard to just ignore them.
It's like seeing something you never noticed before. Once you see it, you can't unsee it.
Exactly. So what do we do with this new awareness? Do we just get rid of all these idioms and expressions that have been around for so long?
I don't think it's about getting rid of them completely. I mean, language changes all the time, and idioms can make our conversations more colorful, more fun. They can create a feeling or an image, and sometimes they even help us explain complex ideas more easily.
But we can at least be more aware of the phrases we're using, right? Like maybe use them less often or at least acknowledge that they're kind of weird?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to think about it. It's about balance, keeping those old sayings, but also being clear, appreciating language, but also making sure we're understood.
And hey, maybe we can even come up with some new phrases that are both meaningful and actually make sense for the world we live in now.
I love that. Language
Yeah.
is always changing, so why not be a part of it, right? Let's make it better.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one thing you want our listeners to remember?
Be more aware of how you use language. Think about the words you choose. Like, ask yourself, does this phrase really mean what I want to say? Or am I just saying something because I've always heard it without really understanding what it means.
That's so important. It's about taking responsibility for our language,
Right.
making real choices about the words we use.
Right. And if you hear a phrase that makes you go, huh, don't be afraid to look into it. Find out where it came from. Think about all the different ways it could be understood, and maybe even try to come up with a better way to say it.
It's like we've been given these secret decoder rings for language, and now we can use them to figure out the hidden meanings behind the words we use.
Exactly. And you never know, maybe you'll even come up with a new phrase that people will be using for years to come. One that's clear, meaningful, and perfectly reflects the way we live now.
That's a great goal to have. Well, we'll leave you all to think about the power of language and all the ways it can trip us up. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of nonsensical phrases. Keep those decoder rings handy and keep exploring the amazing world of language. See you next time.